All right, let's talk hot war in Asia. Sorry. So let's start with the Korean War, which really doesn't get a lot of attention, at least in America. Maybe in Korea it does. So, Korea, that nice little peninsula, similar to China, similar to a lot of Asian nations, had faced occupation of Japan. And so when World War II is over, Korea needs to be, or hopes to be anyways, reunited as independent Korea. Unfortunately, it's not going to work. So Korea is divided right along the 38th parallel there. And up on the northern half of that parallel, in what is North Korea, Kim Il-sung wants to unite Korea as a communist nation. He is supported by the Soviets, and he wants to take all of Korea and unite it back into one Korea as a communist nation. So obviously, the U.S. does not want this to happen. And so the U.S. offers its support to the Southern Korean nationalist, who is maybe not our favorite guy, but at least he's not communist. And so the U.S. is going to throw its support behind Syngman Rhee. And we are going to help Syngman Rhee and the South Koreans stay free. It's what we do. We're the international peacekeepers of the world, okay? We are the watchdogs of the world. Now, Harry Truman is still president. Eisenhower does not take over until 1953, so this is Truman's last hurrah. And this is also the first conflict that the U.S. military is in after World War II, and the troops have been desegregated. So for all the things that Harry Truman has done and all the decisions he made, he does desegregate the military. And so for the first time, we are going to equally give Black Americans the same chance to die as white Americans. So, sorry, that's not funny. On June 25th, 1950, as a surprise to absolutely nobody, I'm sure, Kim Il-sung and the North Korean Communist Party, supported by the Soviets, the North Korean army invades South Korea. Now, Truman doesn't want to get into a war, and so he calls a special session of the United Nations in to decide what to do. The United Nations is very new. They were created in 1948, so they're only 2 years old. They're still working things out, okay? And again, the League of Nations back in World War I, they didn't do much that whole Hitler thing, so we have to approach this differently. And so the Soviets are also now, buddies with Mao over in China because China has fallen to Mao. And so the UN decides that the best thing to do to prevent whatever's happening in Korea is to boycott Soviet products over the things that are happening in Korea and China. And then the UN Security Council says that on top of this boycott, we're going to boycott the Soviets. Really, who that does for anything, they're communists, who cares, but whatever. Sure. The UN Security Council says that they will also authorize the use of force in Korea to stop North Korea from advancing and taking over South Korea. However, when the UN authorizes a force, the security force has to be made up of military from non-involved nations. Okay? So if we're going to make an international military force to stop the North Koreans, it can't be people from South Korea. And most of Europe is still rebuilding, and they've lost a lot of men in World War II. They probably aren't the best choice. So, lo and behold, who makes up most of the UN peacekeeping force? The U.S. military. So, this international force is mostly U.S. military, and General Douglas MacArthur is appointed head of the force. This is the same MacArthur from World War II who left his men in the Philippines and said, I'll be back, and then, came back later after the Bataan Death March, but whatever. So the U.S. Congress agrees to support this police force, but does not declare war. So the U.S. is not at war. North Korea and South Korea are at war, and the U.S. is supplying the police to make sure that the war stays where it is and that North Korea doesn't take over South Korea. But we're not at war. It's just our military who's going over there to fight. So the fighting eventually stabilizes right around that 38th parallel. There's some push and pull, but eventually we stabilize at the 38th parallel. And MacArthur is frustrated. He wants to bomb China, basically. He says, we're going to do whatever's necessary to end this war and make sure communism doesn't spread. And if we have to invade China, we have to invade China. And Truman really gets upset about that. He says, this is not our job. We're not here to do whatever is necessary. We are here as a police force to make sure communism doesn't spread. And so he recalls General MacArthur from the military and from his command, which makes MacArthur mad. But, these things happen. And so after 3 years of fighting in Korea with lots of civilian death and lots of U.S. military troops in death, and there is Chinese troop involvement, but the bulk of this stuff goes on. So the bulk of this fighting is on U.S. soldiers. Again, but hey, at least they're desegregated, so a lot more black men are allowed to die now too. And we do get a lot of Korean orphans from this. We also get a lot of Korean war brides and all that, but those are kind of irrelevant to what we're talking about right now. Not irrelevant to the point. Like, those are actually really big stories, but the war in Korea is 3 years of back and forth fighting between North and South Korea, and nobody's making any progress. And so eventually in 1953, North and South Korea end up just signing an armistice, and they're going to divide Korea at the 38th parallel. And North Korea will stay communist, and South Korea will stay free and capitalist. And that's really it. That's how the war ends. They sign an armistice, they sign a ceasefire, but they never sign a peace treaty. And so there really isn't a satisfying end to this war. A lot of the U.S. people don't really even pay attention to what's going on in Korea unless their husbands are fighting in the war. Meanwhile, we're devastating Korean people. We're getting all sorts of Korean orphans with nowhere to go. We're getting men who go to Korea and take war brides, and then they bring them home with them. And we have the fact that the Koreans still are being interfered with by other countries fighting for their own interests and not letting Koreans fight for Korean interests. And even to this day, there's been no peace treaty signed. It's still divided. There's still no crossing into North and South Korea. They're still two very different countries. So this is the smallest conflict of the Cold War in terms of probably interest. It's not the shortest, but it is the smallest in terms of how much the U.S. and the U.S. people pay attention to it. In fact, a lot of people who fought in Korea, it's considered like the forgotten war. They're not even really paid attention to, which, can be devastating for somebody who was in that situation. So that is the Korean War, and I think in our next videos, we are going to visit conflict in the Middle East. So stick around.